Hi, everyone. I'm Cleaner Brown, and I'm going to discuss integrating justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion within conservation NGOs. Or as I like to think about it, how do we better cater to and center people in conservation work? But before I dive into that, I'd like to ground us in some history. In the 1960s to 1980s, there saw this parallel movements forming. One, the conservation movement had a more naturalist lens with a mandate to protect the environment in its pristine form. And the other, the environmental justice movement, a more people-centered movement, arose due to the statistical fact that people who live, work, and play in many of America's most polluted environments were often people of color or the poor. So considering the socio-political context of this era, the folks who were a part of establishing the conservation and environmental justice movements also looked very different, which can still be seen today. In Green 2.0's 2021 Transparency Report Card, which looks at the racial and ethnic makeup of environmental NGOs, environmental organizations, we see a significant disparity between white and people of color on staff. This difference is even more considerable at the leadership level. This internal lack of representation can lead to a lack of understanding of the communities they are trying to help, and in some cases, doing more harm than good. NGOs are also missing out on stellar candidates because these individuals do not feel welcome in such organizations. These organizations are also limiting their ways of thinking, problem solving, and innovation due to a lack of diverse experiences. And this internal disparity has also led to some unintended consequences in conservation work, as mentioned prior, sometimes doing more harm than good. For example, displacement of local indigenous groups from their cultural lands and lack of inclusion in conservation policy development leading to distrust. But some organizations are trying to address these missteps by adapting a more people-centered approach, as many environmental justice groups have done in the past, which looking at conservation through this lens of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI as I call it. But what is JEDI? Adapting some definitions from the Ocean Justice Advisory Group, justice is the dismantling of systems of oppression and barriers to opportunity. Justice is essential to acknowledge past harm, including historical and systemic harm, disrupt it, and move to new systems. Equity includes practices and outcomes that center the leadership, voice, and experiences of people experiencing oppression. And diversity consists of a broad variety of perspectives, identities, life experiences, which are respected, included, supported, encouraged, and celebrated. Diversity looks beyond their numerical and quantitative representation. Inclusion occurs when there is meaningful participation in decision-making processes and power structures, and a sense of belonging within those social structures is fostered among people and communities, especially among those who have historically not been centered, seen, or heard. And no matter what your institution refers to it as, whether it be JEDI, DEIJ, ideas, all components need to work together. For example, diversity without inclusion can result in tokenism, or equity without justice ignores how we got here today or the systems that exist. We often hear about having a seat at the table, but what about having the knife, the plate, the fork, the cup? Having all elements of JEDI is important, and there are levels to JEDI integration. Firstly, we can implement these JEDI principles at the individual level, asking ourselves, how are we being more just, equitable, and inclusive in our day-to-day lives? JEDI can also be implemented internally within an organization. What is the racial and ethnic makeup? Can folks bring their whole authentic selves to work and feel accepted? Organizations may have JEDI committees, affinity groups, learning spaces. Also thinking about how organizations conduct research. There's also a need to externally integrate JEDI within programmatic public-facing work. How do you share knowledge? Is it accessible? Who will be impacted by your work or the outcomes of your work? External JEDI integration may look like creating outreach materials in multiple languages, holding workshops in the community, or just in general holding space for those most impacted. And so with all these different pathways, I asked myself, how can we integrate JEDI into conservation nonprofits? And the answer I landed on was community engagement, which is the focus of my capstone work. Community engagement is the intentional involvement of stakeholders affected by an issue, and it is just one of the many tools for JEDI integration. But the one I wanted to hone on in, because through a landscape analysis I did at the beginning of my capstone work, I found that this was a gap in conservation work. Community engagement can be implemented on the individual, internal, and external levels. And if we are to learn anything from the environmental justice movement, it is that those on the ground need to be involved in the decision-making process. So my first task was to understand, what is the current state of community engagement within the environmental and conservation nonprofit fields? So at the beginning of my capstone work, I worked with the nonprofit organization Green 2.0, which uses its platform to uplift the voices of historically underrepresented groups within the environmental field. They also hold other environmental NGOs accountable by tracking their internal staff diversity and publicizing it in a report. So during my time with Green 2.0, I conducted research on community engagement within environmental NGOs that work specifically with people of color in coastal communities, and I ended up producing a report that answered 3 questions. How do NGOs engage with local communities? What are some challenges these NGOs face when doing community engagement work? And what are some best practices? So to answer these questions, I interviewed 17 personnel at local, regional, and national NGOs and reviewed the work and strategies of 25 organizations operating primarily within coastal communities of color in California, Florida, and Louisiana. In the interest of time, I won't touch on them all, but the report will be released tomorrow and can be found on Green 2.0's website. But I will highlight 3 best practices that NGOs should do. Firstly, NGOs should center communities in their work by listening to their needs. What you think a community wants and what a community actually needs may be 2 different things. Be open to hearing what the community has to say rather than going in with preconceived ideas, and you may very well end up on a different path that you didn't think of. NGOs should prioritize building and maintaining relationships with the communities they wish to serve. This increases trust, and if there's trust, there is increased buy-in from communities. This may look like attending community meetings or going out on a boat with fishers. The pandemic did present some challenges, but it is especially during times like these when communities need support from institutions. And finally, compensate the community members for their time, expertise, and work. And know that lived experience counts as expertise, and a community member is sharing their time and knowledge with you. Do not just be extractive and take. These are just a few of the best practices found in the report that show that community engagement can be done through a JEDI lens. And as one community organizer from a regional NGO summarizes, if working with the community is not a part of an organization's programmatic work, then they are falling short. And I will add that working with the community in a way that is just, equitable, and inclusive. I hope that this report can be used as a resource for NGOs looking to better understand community engagement, especially with historically underserved groups, to learn what other groups are doing, what are some challenges they face, and how they can be better. And this work with Green 2.0 helped and the lay of the land when it came to community engagement. And I then wanted to shift my focus to working with another NGO to help them become better. So for the second part of my capstone work, I partnered with Ocean Conservancy, which is an ocean advocacy group, which works to create evidence-based solutions for a healthy ocean and the wildlife and communities that depend on it. And this was actually my second time working with Ocean Conservancy, the first time being as a Ray Fellow in 2019. And this time around, I joined the Ocean Justice team, and I see it as stars aligning because this was a newly formed team. So I was very privileged to be with them in its inception. And Ocean Conservancy defines ocean justice as the fair and equitable distribution of both the benefits of the ocean's bounty and the burdens of its complex care. So I worked with the Ocean Justice team to understand the internal organizational connections within Ocean Conservancy and helped in the development of their upcoming small grants program. But my main deliverable was crafting an internal guide for community engagement. I wanted to understand how to help facilitate community engagement, especially for a new team. Several programs within Ocean Conservancy, such as the Arctic, Florida, and Trash-Free Seas programs, considerable community engagement work already, but they don't have like a go-to document. So focusing on the internal community engagement guide I created, which I developed through interviews with staff from different programs and incorporating the feedback I received, they shared that since their work varies, having guiding questions that provoke thought and help them think through their community engagement work would be most helpful. So that's what I did. And I've pulled out 3 questions to highlight. Firstly, how do you define community for this policy or project? A community can look very different depending on the type of work. Is a community a specific group of people like low-income people, people of low income, or do geographical boundaries define the community? For instance, residents in Oakland, like what Tina will be talking about later. Whatever you decide sets the scope of your work. And a follow-up question can be, how do the communities define themselves? Another question is, who would benefit and who would be burdened by your project or policy? Understanding your project's risks and benefits to the communities can help you mitigate them and avoid unintended consequences that cause harm, as I spoke about earlier in the presentation. For example, your project might increase a wetland area, but at the same time may displace one community, but provide recreational services to another community. Using a JEDI lens, what are the implications of this? And finally, how will you continue to partner and deepen relationships with the communities to make sure your efforts are effective and sustainable for the long haul? And as mentioned in the Green 2.0 report, a best practice is building and maintaining relationships in the communities you wish to serve. Engaging with the communities beyond the life cycle of a project is very important. And this may look like having follow-up calls, collaborating on other projects, and asking for feedback. These questions are meant to be asked iteratively during the planning, implementation, and monitoring phases of a project. And I hope that the Ocean Justice team and ultimately Ocean Conservancy uses this document as a guide while keeping in mind that community engagement is only one tool in the JEDI integration toolbox. And as a reminder, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion are all essential elements and must be integrated at all levels, individually, internally, and externally within an organization. Further, start with listening to the community and ensure that they're just not an afterthought. Also, building authentic relationships takes time, and investing that quality time can go a long way in building or rebuilding trust. And finally, I wanted to highlight another best practice from the upcoming Green 2.0 report, which is to invest in young people. Something Ocean Conservancy, CSP, and Green 2.0 all did for me. thus removing the financial barriers and offering opportunities I wouldn't otherwise have had access to. There is no way I would be here talking to you today on this Zoom call had Ocean Conservancy not had that Ray Fellowship position in Santa Cruz back in 2019 that started me down this path. So as I close, I want to thank all my advisors, supervisors, cohort, and anyone who invested time and or money and believed in me. I could not have done this without you. And I really appreciate all of you joining me here today for this presentation. And I've included some information and resources. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.